Patrick, question for you. What is the meaning of the average behavior of citizens? Tell me why we're talking about this today and tell me what that means. Last week.
So USCIS on August 15th issued a policy memorandum that speaks to how an officer adjudicates the good moral character aspect of a naturalization application. And so one of the things that they say in that is they give discretion to the officer to look into a naturalization applicant's activities. And so they're looking at what that applicant has done in the past, whether that be positive or negative. And one of the things that it says is they're going to look at actions that could be technically lawful, but that are inconsistent with the civic responsibility within the community. And they say any other acts that are contrary to the average behavior of citizens in the jurisdiction where aliens reside.
Okay. So before we get into exactly what that means, tell people what these USCIS policy memorandums are and how they're used.
So USCIS regularly issues policy memorandums. So there's nothing really new about that, right? They're basically policy statements that interpret regulations and law, and they change regularly with administration and during administrations. And this is just another example of this administration reading the law and applying the law and regulations in a different way than the previous administration or to even the prior Trump administration.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but basically these memos are given to USCIS officers who are conducting the interviews and evaluating applicants who are applying for naturalizations. These are people who are here legally in the country. They have a green card, permanent residency, maybe some other status that allows them to qualify for naturalization. And so within that criteria, what you have to look for to see if someone qualifies to naturalize and become a U.S. citizen, the law says something about good moral character or something of that effect. Is that correct?
Yes, it speaks to good moral character, but this specific policy memorandum actually amends the policy manual that is published on USCIS's website. So that policy manual is kind of the public-facing document that governs USCIS officers who are adjudicating and how they're to adjudicate various different types of cases or applications that they're handling. In the context of naturalization, a naturalization applicant has to show that they are a person of good moral character. And if they're a person of good moral character, then they satisfy that prong of the naturalization adjudication process. And what this did was modify that. And it modifies the manual itself.
And so just to help people along, like the law and the regulation involved here is very short and vague, right? Like, is it just good moral character? And then the memo explains, okay, what does that mean? What do we want you to take into account when you're judging whether someone has good moral character or not? Am I correct?
Yeah, so the statute itself says that a person applying for naturalization must demonstrate that, quote, he or she has been and continues to be a person of good moral character during the statutory period, which is either 5 years or 3 years, depending on what context you're applying in.
Right. So that's been the law for years, right? It's been the law probably for decades. So the question has always been, well, what does that mean? So over the years, USCIS issues these memorandums, like a training manual, to the USCIS officers who are making these decisions. And so this instructs them on, okay, what are you looking for when you say is it good moral character? Does it mean the person has never been arrested? Does it mean the person has only been arrested for misdemeanors? Does it mean the person was arrested but the charges were dropped? What other things does it take into account? Because I think traditionally in the last few years, you mainly were concerned about arrests, right? When somebody's got a green card, they're applying to be a citizen, they may not be able to take that next step if they have a criminal charge or especially a felony on their record that could basically deny them the ability to become a citizen and potentially even get them deported because they've now alerted USCIS that they have this criminal history.
Well, and just a DUI is not a deportable offense. However, it is mentioned in this in this policy memorandum. So a DUI, for instance, we see people apply for naturalization all the time with DUIs. If you have 2 or more convictions for driving under the influence, then that's going to be an issue for you. You have your negative analysis, which is what they previously primarily focused on. Have you avoided engaging in things that were bad? Now, I mean, they're definitely looking into whether or not you've done bad things, whether that's violations of the law, failure to pay your child support or taxes and things like that. But they're also looking at what are you doing positively, right? Are you engaged in any kind of community activities that are positive for the community? You could always submit that previously, but if you didn't, they very rarely asked you about it. Now they're looking at things like if you say you did have a DUI, they're going to want to see rehabilitation. If you were overdue on, say, your child support, they're going to want to see that you've overcome those. But as far as the question that we're looking at as well, the problem of what are acts that are contrary to the average behavior of citizens in the jurisdiction where the applicant resides is that's a level of discretion that is it leaves the door wide open potentially for the officer, and I don't see any guidance that would limit that.
Yeah,
what
so
does
the
that
big
mean?
change here is that previously it mainly focused on your client's potential criminal history. If you didn't have any, great. Now USCIS is opening the door to also look at non-criminal behavior that may be contrary to what the average citizen in the community does. Okay, that's extraordinarily broad. That gives them an enormous amount of discretion. And I think our first thought was, well, that could be used very liberally and very differently from officer to officer. But it's the kind of thing that seems to be pointing towards, hey, if you're out protesting things that are maybe contrary to the majority in your jurisdiction, such as if you're protesting a war, maybe a war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza. These have been, very politically charged protests that, and we've seen protesters being deported. This is the type of thing where, is that opening the door for an applicant who has no criminal history, but may have taken steps to express their political views on some global thing happening in the world, that it can negatively affect their application for citizenship?
Yeah, I think it does.
So if you are a type of person that wears your politics out on your sleeve, it's maybe not a good idea to do this while you're waiting on your naturalization application.
Or even
That
before
those
you
things
intend
will
to
be
apply.
considered potentially, and
Yeah.
it could have a serious negative effect. You don't have any arrests, but you're being very vocal about whatever political position that you're taking, and the USCI officer looks at this and says, I just find this is un-American. You're got a chance of being denied.
Yeah, it opens the door for, I think, political acts that can be construed as, say, supporting terrorism. A lot of concern is how do you apply this? Say you live in New York City, and then say another person lives in Fife, Alabama. That's a little bitty town in Alabama. It's a very rural. Would you apply a different standard for somebody that lives in Fife, Alabama than you would for, say, an applicant that lives in New York City? What does that mean? How can you have any kind of real universal application of standards? What does that do to when you're trying to appeal a contrary decision? What does that look like, right? To me, it opens the door for an officer to have kind of unlimited discretion as to what that officer views what the average behavior of citizens in a community is.
Yeah, and I think that
Right.
that's an important nuance to this. I'm hoping that that's the way that it's going to be interpreted by the officers, that, if you've got a immigrant community in a city, like I just returned from Chicago, there was a very large amount of people from Middle Eastern countries there. And so there were very large protests on almost a weekly basis for things supporting, the Palestine movement, things like that you don't typically see in a large scale in Savannah, Georgia. So if somebody in Savannah is out walking around with a Palestinian flag and shouting things, et cetera, or a public member of a organization that supports Palestine, it could be viewed differently than in Chicago or New York City, where there are large populations of people in that immigrant community that probably share those views. Whereas here, you would be more of an outlier. If you were in Fife, Alabama, you might be the only person. I don't know anything about Fife, but it doesn't seem to have a huge immigrant community from some of these places in the world. So that's maybe something that will be looked at, that if the applicant is in Illinois or applying, lives in Chicago, an officer would be in Illinois or Chicago and maybe looking at that and saying, yeah, we see this all the time. Whereas if you're in a smaller community where you don't have a lot of people sharing those views, that officer could deny the same person because it's not consistent with what the average person in that immigration community, their values are, right? I mean, and it's such like, what does that mean? Like, it doesn't even make a lot of sense. I think the problem we have with it is that it's extremely broad. It's just a lot of discretion, which creates uncertainty. And what you're looking for when you take these cases and you're advising your clients is some level of certainty and consistency and how these packets and these interviews are going to be seen by the officers. And this just seems to create a lot more potential uncertainty here. But let's talk about the good things. I do like the fact that they're openly stating that we want to see, what good you've done in your community, because some of our clients have, amazing, backgrounds as far as helping their communities, being very involved in civic organizations, helping other members of their immigrant community. These kinds of things will be taken into effect. Things like, do you volunteer at a soup kitchen? These just kind of simple acts that better the community. These are now things that we know we should really highlight when we have them, because they're going to be considered in the approval process.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that they framed it. They say that it's a return to a more holistic test. And I think that there was a concern under the legal framework prior to this change. They were saying that in assessing conditional bars, officers have authority and now explicit directive to weigh all relevant evidence, both adverse and favorable, before granting or denying. We've been focused, I think, on maybe a negative application, how the officers can have discretion to deny everything, but it also opens the door for them to potentially approve petitions or applications for naturalization where there was rehabilitation and reformation and demonstrated good acts that kind of mitigate the previous bad act, if you will. But it also potentially opens the door for it to be used to recognize activities that society generally kind of universally considers as good. Those will have greater weight, evidently, under this new test. So
Great.
that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a more holistic approach is always a positive. And I think that they are taking into consideration that you've got a good, upstanding person here that deserves to be a U.S. citizen who's shown, not just that they can stay out of trouble, but they're actually, contributing to the society in ways that are not required of them. And that's definitely something that going forward, we will be looking for and trying to highlight now that we know that USCIS is going to be instructed to take those things into strong consideration. When did this go into effect?
August 15th, 2025. Okay. But I think for applicants, people that are going to be applying, they need to be prepared for much greater scrutiny on their applications. Their behavior doesn't have to be illegal. You're going to need to consider how you behave outside of just following the criminal law and not breaching that, but also behaving in a way that's consistent with what most people in society consider decent behavior, right? Because you've got a very subjective standard here that really the officer seems to have almost unlimited discretion.
And I think for us, the difference here is that when you're trying to predict what might happen, when you have an applicant, the client wants to know how likely is this to get approved. Now, depending on your situation, you have no criminal history, but there could still be something in your background that an officer finds as a negative towards whether they should approve your application. Probably not very many cases that's going to apply to, but if you do have somebody that's, maybe had some accusations of harassment. There might have a messy family situation or something like that, that there's been, temporary restraining orders put against them that were civil but not criminal, even if those things were dismissed. These are kinds of things that you might get requests for evidence on, because the officer may want to look at all of that before they stamp it as approved. So just a pretty significant change in how we understand that they are reviewing applications for naturalization. Is this only naturalization, or is this for other types of immigration relief?
No, this is all naturalization.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we'll be finding out what the average behavior of citizens in a community is soon. That's about the broadest thing I could ever think that you could phrase something, but it's interesting.
If you like this discussion and you found it informative, make sure you hit subscribe so you can get notified when we do it again. On